All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for being here today. We might have a few more people trickle in as time goes on, but that's okay. Thanks for joining us. We're here to talk about another in our co-learning webinar series on cumulative impacts. We have a couple of great speakers here with us today. Kind of what we're going for today in particular is learning a little bit more about community benefit agreements or other similar sort of programs that are around the United States. So we encourage you, if you have any questions, comments on what you're hearing from any of our speakers today, that's what we're here to learn along with you as well. PCA is not going to be presenting any particular information today. We're just as interested in hearing what our speakers have to say as hopefully you are. So what we're hoping is we're going to share a little bit about those. We'll share about some of the process. We'll tee up when the next webinar and the topic of the next webinar is. And we're going to be joined today by our facilitators from DeYoung Consulting. So they'll help us out move through the process today. Just as a quick look, we'll start. We'll have time for questions and answers in between each speaker. If you could try and keep your questions focused on what each speaker has presented about. If we have extra time at the end, we can certainly circle back to any questions for any speaker or questions for both speakers. We'll do a little closing at the end before we call it a day, call it an afternoon. So just as a reminder, what we're looking at today is cumulative impacts. Going through this rulemaking, we are trying to share where we're at now, where we're hopefully going in the future. Again, PCA is going to be sort of listening. I might add in a couple things here and there, just kind of dependent, but this is really to learn from and hear from the speakers we have today. So if you do have any things that are sort of more focused questions or comments for PCA, we'll certainly write those down, take note of those, maybe get back to those at a future meeting, future working session kind of thing. So with that, where we are right now, again, this is our co-learning webinar series, learning about different aspects. This is sort of getting close to wrapping up. We'll kind of be done maybe roughly around May. We'll have a little bit more on working sessions roughly this summer throughout the fall. This is all in support of kind of getting towards that proposed rule that we need by roughly May of 2026. So we're going to be looking for a lot of input on a whole bunch of different aspects. Today, we're going to be focused just on one of those in particular. If you want to go to the next slide, please. But just so you can again sort of see, we're being asked and we're asking for your input on all of these different areas. What we're looking at is really just one of these bullets today. Bullet number 4, what's the content of a community benefit agreement and what's the procedures for entering into those? So hopefully we'll have some good discussion surrounding what the speakers are going to share with us today. And I think with that, I'll hand it over to DeYoung to introduce the two speakers we have.
Thank you, Hassan. And I will also say welcome to everybody. Thanks for showing up today and being part of the webinar. My name is Anna Peters. I am with DeYoung Consulting Services along with my two colleagues today, Vanessa Steele and Amy Snelling. And like Hassan said, we're working with PCA to in the role of facilitators for these webinars. So welcome, and I am very happy to be able to introduce the speakers today. We will first hear from Ben Pauli, Dr. Ben Pauli, and I'll tell you a little bit about him and then hand it over to you, Ben, to share your own content. So Ben Pauli is an associate professor of social science at Kettering University in Flint, Michigan. He holds a PhD in political science from Rutgers University. Dr. Pauli has been extensively involved in the response to the Flint water crisis as both a Flint resident and as well as a researcher. He's the author of Flint Fights Back, Environmental Justice and Democracy in the Flint Water Crisis. He's the president of the board of the Environmental Transformation Movement of Flint and also acting chair of the Flint Water System Advisory Council. Dr. Pauli is a representative of the academic community as well, and the Environmental Protection Agency's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And in that capacity, he's served on work groups focused on water infrastructure, PFAS, and cumulative impact assessment. Dr. Pauli has also served on work groups under the National Drinking Water Advisory Council, focused on consumer confidence reports and microbial and disinfection byproducts rules. His water-related research and advocacy interests include issues of water and trust, water governance, environmental justice, and principles of engagement and collaboration in community-based research. So we will be hearing from him. Thank you so much for being here, Ben.
Thanks very much for the invitation. Let me see if I can manage to share my screen successfully. Hopefully everybody is seeing that. Yes. It's the beginning of a Google
Looks good.
slideshow. Okay, cool. Let me get the actual slideshow feature going here. Okay, great. Well, again, thanks very much for having me today. I'm happy to be with everyone and very much looking forward to the conversation. I hope it won't deflate anybody's hopes and expectations to lead off by saying that I am not an expert in community benefits agreements, although I think that at least some of what I have to say today will touch pretty centrally upon this issue of how we conceptualize benefit, which I think is a really important part of establishing a solid foundation to any community benefits agreement. And so as we transition into the more kind of practical examples that I think we'll get from our other speaker, I hope that I've managed to lay a little bit of a conceptual foundation that will prove to be useful during our discussion. So as was mentioned, I do live and work in Flint. And as you may or may not know, we recently commemorated the 10th anniversary of the Flint water crisis. And because that event in particular has been such an important touchstone in my own thinking about cumulative impact, I thought I'd begin by approaching the topic through that lens. And again, I'm not only going to talk about impact in the sense of negative health impacts and so forth, but we can also talk along the way about benefits, because I really think these are the flip sides of the same coin. The way in which we conceptualize impacts has a lot to do with the way in which we end up conceptualizing benefit. And the people who are empowered to define impact are often those who are also empowered to define what a benefit looks like. And I'll certainly be making some remarks on that along the way. So even 10 years into the Flint water crisis, we are in some sense engaged in an ongoing discussion about what that crisis is. Even if we're just looking at it in terms of impact, who was impacted, how are they impacted, how serious were the impacts? These can be pretty difficult questions to answer depending on how you're thinking about impact. Certainly, once you start considering cumulative impact, how various impacts intersect and influence and perhaps magnify each other, the picture starts to get pretty complex. And one of the things I realized pretty early on in my research on the crisis was that I was certainly not going to be able to wrap my head all the way around that complicated picture. Any representation I tried to create of that impact was going to be woefully incomplete. And I think that's often the case when we're trying to assess the impact of an event or a development project or anything really, what that impact has been or might be. There's going to be a great deal that we don't know and maybe never will know. And there may also be considerable uncertainty about what we think we know. So in cases like these, it matters very much, I think, who is doing the knowing, who is producing knowledge about impact, who controls that knowledge, who gets to communicate it and make decisions on the basis of it. And again, I think we could flip that around and say the exact same thing about who is knowing and defining and communicating about benefit, right? So in Flint, the first part of the popular struggle here was simply to get officials to recognize as valid the evidence that residents were presenting of negative impacts from the water. And that struggle took about 18 months. And for those 18 months, community knowledge of what would come to be called the Flint water crisis was for all intents and purposes dismissed by the people calling the shots. And a lot of people, including my 3-year-old son, drank the water in the meantime. Once officials acknowledged the existence of a serious problem, a different kind of struggle began, a struggle to define the scope of the impact. And all along, I would argue, it's been in the interest of state institutions and others who are trying to limit their liability to characterize the impact of the crisis in the narrowest possible way. So you steer people's attention toward lead and get them to think of the crisis as a lead and water crisis when it was so much more. And then you gradually pull the rug out from under even that framing by building up an argument that the harm done from lead was really not that bad. And meanwhile, maybe people will forget, or maybe they never heard to begin with because of all the emphasis on lead, that at least 12 people died of bacterial disease, Legionnaire's disease, related to the water. And there were other water quality problems too that are likely to have had at least some health impact. And that's before we even begin to talk about the mental health impacts, the damage to people's property from corrosive water, the expense and disruption of having to procure bottled water, the breakdown of trust in people and institutions connected to water, and on and on. And in order to understand the impact of any one of these things, we must, of course, look at them together, as well as the way in which they intersect with underlying sources of disadvantage and difficulty that were present before the water crisis came along. Although I don't have a lot of confidence in our ability to add up all of that definitively, what I am sure of is that we won't get anywhere close without involving impacted residents very centrally in the conversation. To look at the statistics on Legionnaire's victims is one thing. To listen to residents like Jasmine McBride, who tragically lost her life to Legionnaires at the age of 30, talk about their lived experience is quite another matter. Listening closely to the stories of the impacted brings into focus nuances and connections that may otherwise be invisible, surprising ways in which the reverberations of environmental contamination can find their way into every corner of somebody's life and indeed have cumulative effects on that life. Even with all of the buzz going on right now around cumulative impacts, it's still not very clear to me that we're learning everything that we might learn from these kinds of experiences and taking steps to ensure that they matter within knowledge-making and decision-making processes. So let me just give a brief anecdote connected to the case I just mentioned. Last year, I served on a work group under the National Drinking Water Advisory Council to EPA that was asked to recommend some revisions to Safe Drinking Water Act rules aimed at stopping the spread of deadly waterborne bacteria like Legionella, which causes Legionnaire's disease. If we're trying to understand and mitigate the impact of Legionnaires, one thing we probably want to know is that the impact is disproportionate. It's more pronounced within certain populations, for example, among African Americans. But in order to understand the size and significance of that disproportionality, I thought it was important that we consider the impact cumulatively. And I thought that if we're going to do that, why don't we invite someone from Flint who had actually had Legionnaires to talk to the group. Long story short, I kept being told by the facilitators that there were too many people on this work group who wouldn't see the relevance of listening to anecdotal accounts. And finally, I said, just let me show a 2-minute video clip of Jasmine speaking about her experience. But again, I was told, no, we probably shouldn't do that. So in that work group, we spent an entire year talking about those issues that I mentioned without taking so much as 2 minutes to hear from someone who is actually living with the problem we're trying to solve. It was as if the quantitative data we were looking at was all that was needed to form our conclusions and make our decisions about both what the problem was and secondarily, how to deal with it, how to bring benefit, to impacted people. And, I do think there's a risk that that kind of attitude will prevail even as we get more serious about expanding the number of variables we're looking at and as we get more technically sophisticated about the way we evaluate them. Those who are most excited about the prospects for cumulative impact assessment right now, like my friend Charles Lee, who's been waiting a very long time for this stuff to be taken seriously, are excited largely because of the development of more refined analytical techniques for processing quantitative data. He writes here about the journey from merely, that's my term, describing to quantifying to mapping impacts, with the mapping involving the bundling of quantitative indicators and the creation of things like environmental justice scores for particular geographical areas. Within this schema, I would argue that people like Jasmine risk being pretty marginalized. They are the mere describers. And maybe the describers are pointing out smoke that's going to lead us to a real fire, but we won't really know until the quantifiers, the analyzers, get busy doing what they do. And it will be on the basis of their conclusions, their knowledge, that decisions get made. Now, in fairness, Charles himself is very aware of and concerned about that possibility. He points out that no mapping tool or analytical methodology is ever going to be able to capture all the real-life complexity of a disproportionately impacted community. Hence, the need for local knowledge and the ability of communities to speak for themselves will always remain. In fact, this speaks to the continued importance of qualitative information in environmental analysis and decision-making. And notice here that Charles is not arguing that people should speak for themselves simply as a matter of moral principle. He's placing epistemological value on that kind of speech. In other words, when people speak about their own experiences, how they are impacted, how they are likely to be benefited by something, we are likely to learn more, to know more than we would otherwise. If we adopt an overly technical approach to cumulative impact, we might end up drawing a picture with sharp lines that's easier to talk about and make decisions on the basis of. But it's going to be somewhat artificial and incomplete. Reality is fuzzier, and we can't get at that fuzz, the texture of impact, without community voices playing a central role in our conversation. So, I'm sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. It's not new to suggest that we should listen to people. Lots of lip service is paid to that notion, and lots of motions are gone through to collect public comment and so forth. But how do we ensure that the knowledge possessed by people with lived experience actually matters within environmental decision-making? Well, I think there are a couple of ways that we ensure that. One is that we do a better job of educating people in positions of influence what people with lived experience are bringing to the table. And we encourage people to respect their knowledge and factor that more into the way they make decisions about and come to conclusions about impact and benefit. Another possibility is that we give those people with lived experience more direct power over outcomes. And in that way, they may be able to make their knowledge matter whether people believe them and respect them or not. But we're a long ways from having done that, of course. And again, another example from Flint offers not only a useful crystallization of the issues at hand, but an illustration of the distance we have to travel to get to where we need to be. If there's one part of Flint that positively screams cumulative impact, it's the city's northeast side, where one finds a large cluster of polluting facilities, not far from a couple of low-income housing developments. One of those facilities, the Genesee Power Station, was the subject of a historic struggle in the 90s when Flint activists submitted a pioneering civil rights complaint to try and block the facility's construction. Yes, hello? I don't know if that was intentional or not. And I've just got a few more minutes here in case anybody's concerned about the time. As I was saying, this station was the subject of a historic struggle and civil rights complaint back in the 90s. And in an equally historic development 30 years later, in the context of the Flint water crisis, the EPA finally found that Flint residents had been discriminated against in the process of approving the permit for this facility. It determined that African-American residents in particular had not had adequate and equal opportunity to express themselves about the proposed project, and that this was a symptom of deeper issues within the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality's plan for public participation and non-discrimination. So you would think that with all of that history, any company wishing to build yet another polluting facility in this area, which was operating in good faith anyway, would go out of its way to engage community members early in the process. Alas, when the Ajax Asphalt Company came to town looking to build a hot mix asphalt plant just down the road from the Genesee Power Station, that's not what happened. Long story short, the community once again had to organize to ensure that its voice was heard, both by Ajax and by the state. It took legal action and a new civil rights complaint to EPA to win community members a seat at the table during negotiations over the permit. And after a long series of meetings that seemed promising at first, these community members got almost none of what they were asking for and were left feeling like they'd been misled and that their time was wasted. Now that the state has expressed a willingness to do a cumulative impact analysis in the area, after the facility has already been built, after it's already operating, community members are not exactly eager to offer their time, energy, and lived experience to that endeavor. However, by heightening scrutiny of polluting facilities in the area, connecting the dots between different kinds of impact, and foregrounding the struggle of impacted residents, their organizing is having an effect. It helped lead recently to a notable enforcement action against another nearby facility that will have to install a new pollution control and capture system. And perhaps even more notable is the case of Universal Coding, whose application for an amendment to their permit prompted the state to proactively hold a public hearing about it in Flint. Universal Coding actually showed up to this hearing and ultimately agreed to voluntarily lower pollution limits in the revised permit beyond what was required by law, with some encouragement by the Air Quality Division at the state. So I don't think it's likely that these kinds of victories will ever just be handed to communities. It will continue to be necessary to organize and exert popular pressure. But there are things that government institutions can do to help level the playing field. We still have a ways to go in Michigan getting our state DEQ to side with communities over industry in scenarios like the ones described. In some other parts of the country, notably in Chicago, we are starting to see agencies put their thumbs more emphatically on the community side of the scale. In Chicago, as you may know, there was recently a historic permit denial on cumulative impact grounds. And that, from what I can tell anyway, involved taking the lived experience of community members pretty seriously. So rather than getting further into that example, in the interest of time, I'll leave it at that. And again, just by reiterating that, without these community members at the table to help characterize both what the underlying impacts are that we're trying to address and what benefit would look like in the face of those impacts, we're not going to get very far down the road I think we all want to travel. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pauli, for that. That is an incredible description of a highly complex challenge, and I appreciate your description and for bringing us along the journey that you have been a part of. So we have about 15 or 20 minutes for all of you who are present, for you to present any questions or comments that you have for Dr. Pauli regarding the content that he just presented. So if you're able to access the chat, you can type your questions in there and I will make sure to represent them as kind of a moderator, if you will. If you can't find the chat, and if you're welcome to use the hand raise function if you are aware of that. There's always a bit of a delay as people type their thoughts. If there are any points you want to elaborate on, Dr. Pauli, you're welcome to as people process all of your information.
Well, I'm certainly known for my rambling. So that's, I don't know if that just comes with the territory of being a professor, but we all have to fill time when students aren't willing to speak up and so forth. So I think we tend to be pretty practiced at that. It looks like we did have a request come in through the chat, and I can try to oblige here. Please expand on the process that led to the denial of a permit in Chicago. So I should start by saying that I'm always super cautious about talking about communities that I do not belong to, because I've just seen way too many instances of people talking about Flint without really knowing what they're talking about. And I don't want to, be guilty of the very same thing in talking about Chicago. So I'll just tell you what I think I know, and you can take that, with as large a grain of salt as you like. But, the backstory, as I understand it, to that particular permit denial was that there was a polluting facility that was moving from part of town more kind of on the north side to the south side, which is, majority minority and already is, suffering from a lot of impacts of various kinds. And there was a real concerted community mobilization around that permit request that really, emphasized bringing attention to those kind of underlying conditions within the community and encouraging the Chicago Department of Health to take those seriously in its decision about the permit. And what ended up happening is that, the department did its due diligence and did the usual analysis. If they were doing it the same old way, only, they might have stopped right there and said, look, this facility is going to stay under the legal limits that are in place here. And so we have no right to deny them their request for this permit. But they went a little further than that in this case. And they looked at this in terms of actually not only cumulative impact, but cumulative risk. They looked at the underlying, quality of life within the community and how that was likely to be affected by this facility. And they ended up denying the permit on that basis. And as far as I know, this is essentially the first time in American history that that a permit to pollute, has been denied on what are essentially cumulative impact grounds. And so, I think it really is precedent setting. And there are a lot more details you can read about here than I'm able to give you. And I would be cautious about wading too much further into the weeds for the reasons I mentioned before. But I think that there are a lot of other cities, states as well, whose eyes are kind of on Chicago right now to see how this plays out. I'm not sure exactly where things stand, like right up to the present moment. I think it was inevitable that there were going to be legal challenges there. And one of the things that I've learned is that so much of this stuff ends up getting played out in the courtroom, in front of judges who may have never heard this term cumulative impacts before and are nevertheless going to be the ones to determine whether or not something is legally permissible. So, to me, that's a very problematic dynamic, actually, and we need to be taking a look at that legal angle and how we, educate people like judges about some of these issues. Again, I think it will go down in history as a pretty historic struggle. And I'm just catching up on what came in through the chat here. The asphalt plant for DEQ issued the permit and asked EPA for advice about doing better. Yeah, can you speak to the issue of regulators acting like they don't have power to deny a permit to protect public health? Yeah, that is something that regulators like to plead in their defense. One of the things that our local activists, I think, were good about doing was highlighting some of the language in state law that shows that actually they can do more than what they tend to do. That the law actually, it certainly does not forbid them. And in fact, in some cases, explicitly enables them to, proactively do things like cumulative impact assessments. And in practice, those are, of course, difficult to do. And, for various reasons, those tend to be avoided in practice. But I do think that just from like an activism organizing, perspective, that's potentially powerful strategy is to reveal the ways in which our state institutions are just at the end of the day kind of being too timid, the ways in which they could actually go further even under the law as written. And so, in this case, one of the things the activists also tried to do was to get multiple branches of government kind of playing off each other and to get the feds, to try to push the State Department further than it was willing to go. And one of the things the State Department was saying, which, you know, has some truth to it, is that, look, you know, everybody wants us to start doing cumulative impacts assessment, but nobody's really explained how we should do that. The EPA has been incredibly slow in putting together a framework for that kind of analysis. And so the EPA is certainly partly to blame for that. And, you know, it does appear that maybe in the, you know, coming year or so, you know, it will be offering more concrete guidance, but then also, you know, maybe following up and nudging the states further in that direction than they would otherwise go. But I think, you know, that's going to be part of the solution here, because right now, you know, what we've seen in Michigan is the state just kind of punting on this to some extent and saying, well, you know, EPA needs to be the one to explain how this is supposed to work. Please discuss the forces. Sorry, I can go ahead and read the questions, or I can pause.
There's a follow-up to what you just addressed. I think
Okay.
let's get to that, and then we'll get to the chat that we got from Linda. So Nahid is asking how to address or counter those, perhaps with an example.
To counter, so
This is a follow-up to.
As a follow-up to the earlier question, I just want to make sure that was an elaboration on the question I was just answering. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So the those in this case are the regulators' denials of their ability to act, I assume. Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's probably you need a multiple strategy approach. Again, you know, we do have a system that allows us to appeal to the federal level when we're dissatisfied by what states are doing. And depending on what kind of an administration is in place in Washington, you know, that can be more or less effective. But, you know, I think in this case, even more important than that, honestly, is what has ended up happening on the legal side. Because as I mentioned, the activists were pursuing a civil rights complaint that was, you know, related to all of this, and, you know, including their demand for a cumulative impacts assessment. And there is a lot of concern right now that if the EPA acts aggressively on those kinds of civil rights complaints, they're going to get challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court, and civil rights law in this country is going to end up getting gutted. And so EPA itself has become very, very timid in terms of its willingness to take big swings on the civil rights front. And so, you know, that hasn't really helped matters in terms of trying to, you know, leverage the authority of the federal government in all of this. So, you know, then, there are other kinds of legal tactics you can pursue. They've also tried going through HUD and filing a complaint with HUD. In this case, you know, you can look to different federal agencies. Some of it is just exposing what's going on, though, to the public and trying to muster some popular pressure. And that's been another tactic.
We have a number of chats, and Dr. Pauli, I can help you keep track.
Okay.
So you don't lose track. So we have a question that it may have been answered by another person. I'll say it anyway in case there's something you want to add. So Linda asks, what year was the asphalt plant permit denied due to cumulative impacts? And then later we see a response denial was February 2022. Administrative law judge overturned the permit denial on June 1st, 2023. Would you add anything to that?
Yeah, well, just one correction. So we might be conflating two things here a little bit. So the asphalt plant is the plant in Flint that they went ahead and built. That permit was not denied. The plant in Chicago, I actually forget what exactly it is they do there, but it's not an asphalt plant. But yeah, I think that timing is right. At least it comports with my own fuzzy memory.
Thank you. We have a question from Chris. Are there examples from Flint where a community benefit agreement or something similar was used to advance or resolve an issue raised by the community?
Yeah, I don't think, you know, to be honest, maybe this is one of the reasons why I don't know much about community benefits agreements, like at least from a practical perspective, is that I don't think we have had a lot of, notable examples of that sort of thing. the one example I wanted to give of the company voluntarily limiting their, pollution is, I mean, you could see that as being, one piece of that was not in any way a formal community benefits agreement, but, that was a case of industry saying, we are, respectful enough of the concerns of the community that we're willing to modify our behavior in order to address, some of their concerns. Is that, I think it's wrong even to call that a benefit, really. I mean, you could call that, lessening impact or lessening harm, right? But, when we talk about benefit, in theory, we're not just, trying to reduce harm. We're trying to offer the community something positive, in its place. And, I must say that we have in Flint heard a lot of talk about benefits coming to the community. That is something that we're very, very familiar with. And I think it's an extremely problematic discourse. And, we hear this from the state, we hear this from the feds too. I sat at an EPA meeting not long ago and I listened to somebody high up in EPA talking about all of the ways in which the agency is benefiting Flint. And she, I think, was unaware that there was somebody from Flint in the room who, could essentially call bullshit on that, which isn't to say that EPA hasn't done a lot for Flint. It has. I'm not trying to deny that. But in this case, I could tell that this was pretty empty rhetoric. And so I asked just quite simply for some explanation of what the benefits were that she was referring to. And she had no explanation. I mean, she could give me no tangible details that, could have satisfied any actual member of the community. And so, what I was realizing is that I think we have a lot of people out in the world like that who are talking about, well, I've benefited this community and I've benefited that community. And, when you really kind of corner them and force them to, explain themselves, they can't really always do that in a very concrete way. And more importantly, why would it be up to them to determine that a community has been benefited? Why wouldn't it be up to the community, right? If I'm a member of that community and I'm not seeing the benefit, then, it's pretty problematic for somebody else to be out there going around saying, benefit this and benefit that. So, again, I think it's just as important that community members have a really central role in the conversation when we're talking about benefit, just as when we're talking about impact. They need to be part of the process of defining what a benefit is to begin with, much less determining whether any particular thing has been beneficial. And so, I'm a little wary just in general of the language of benefit, to be honest with you. But certainly if anybody were to come to Flint proposing a community benefit agreement, I would want to see that the community played a very central role from the beginning of that discussion, defining benefits, to begin with, much less anything that follows from that definition.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions, and that may be the time that we have for now for Dr. Pauli, but please, for everyone listening, you are welcome to continue to digest and add your comments and add your questions. We're still going to document those, and if we end up running out of time and we can't get to your question today, they will still be taken back. So don't feel like your time is ending in terms of your ability to chat a question. We have a question from Mary. Can Ben or someone talk about what may have more real world value for impacted communities using a quote precautionary principle process or cumulative impacts process? Or do these go hand in hand and both are needed? Can you speak to that, or is that
I can try, although if
someone
wants to jump in, please feel free, because again, I can ramble on whether or not I know what I'm talking about. Yeah, so I think that this idea of precautionary principle is something that you'll find a lot of support for, certainly in Flint, and I would guess in many other similarly impacted communities. I think that a lot of people believe it to be kind of nuts, the way that we treat our environment, the way we put things out into the world without actually having good information, on the front end about what the likely consequences are going to be. We wait to see kind of what breaks and who gets hurt, And then maybe we try to add up all of that hurt, although, more likely we're just looking at one little aspect of hurt at a time and not even getting that whole picture. And so, there's something about even the cumulative impacts approach that it's like this after the fact, type approach where we've already got all this impact going on in the world. And it's like all we can ask people to do is to try to take all of it seriously, rather than representing it in a reductionist way. And so, I think a precautionary approach is different in the sense that, we try to get ahead of these problems. And it's better not to bring the impacts into the world than it is to try to, add them up later and rectify them. And so, I think that I don't know if the United States, again, is famous for being different than other, approaches to environmental regulation and enforcement when it comes to this stuff. But, I think that one of the things that, ultimately communities are striving for is, at the very least, the ability to say no to new projects that even have the potential of worsening impacts. And I think that is, as late in the game as it may be, a kind of precautionary approach moving forward, at least, right? It's to say that, look, we don't want to take even the risk. It's just not worth it to us to take the risk of a new facility experiencing some kind of disaster or breaking the laws that it agreed to abide by or whatever. We just don't even want to risk that as a community. And we should have some say over what we want to risk and what we don't. It's our quality of life, after all, that we're talking about here. And so, I do think that that's kind of the holy grail in some ways of, kind of the environmental justice movement. It's to empower communities like this enough that they can be the ones to say that, I'm sorry, regardless of what the law says and whether somebody's technically following it, we just don't want to take on those added risks given everything else that we're experiencing. But again, it will take a lot really to put communities in that position, certainly in any systemic way.
Thank you. I'm going to squeeze in this last question. I'm not seeing any more come in, so we'll squeeze this one in. I think it's along the same lines. If you have anything to add, Dr. Pauli. Cassandra says, you recommended giving people with lived experience more influence over decisions that impact them. Is the permit in Chicago an example of this, in your opinion, or what does this look like in practice, where people have actual influence outside of practices as they are now? Public notices.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Comment.
Yeah, to me, that's kind of like the $1 million question, right? Anytime you're handing power over to anybody, whether or not it's a, community member, you want to be careful about, how you're structuring that. Because anybody who possesses power could be in a position to use it unwisely, to abuse it, et cetera. Of course, we've already handed all kinds of power over to people who in various ways, lack competence, or maybe integrity or whatever. And so, a lot of what we're talking about is trying to correct for that imbalance. And in that sense, I don't know that we have a whole lot to fear from, striking a slightly different balance. What happened in Chicago, I think I wouldn't use the word direct, to describe the power that the community exercised in that case, because after all, at the end of the day, it was the Department of Public Health who that was making that decision. But I do think that the community exercised a whole lot of indirect power, and in this case, they had folks in positions of decision-making, power who were willing to listen to them and take them seriously. And I think that had a really big impact in this case. But of course, you don't always have that. And so the question becomes, how are you going to create an institution that creates inlets for popular influence, even when you don't have sympathetic people who are, running the institution? And I think there are different ways that you can do that. I mean, one of the things that came out of the Flint water crisis was a kind of revival of a proposal to allow communities to file kind of complaints in sort of environmental complaints with our state Department of Environmental Quality, if there was some specification about how many signatures you had to have and so forth. But it's the kind of thing that institutionally would have triggered a particular kind of follow-up and a particular kind of action on the part of the state, again, regardless of who happened to be in power. And so I think that there are maybe some things that you can do institutionally that create those kinds of automatic triggers. At the very least. Again, we're still a ways from talking about putting communities, directly in charge of decisions. And I think maybe that's a longer, more complicated conversation, but that's at least maybe one step down that road.
Thank you so much. The content that you presented, your presence here today in front of everybody, and for your thoughtful responses, really appreciate it very much, Dr. Pauli.
My pleasure.
And thanks to everybody for adding your questions. And of course, like I said, you're welcome to keep on adding. I am going to introduce our next speaker. And before I do that, I will reiterate. So as people listen, everyone is welcome to type into the chat whatever comes to mind. You don't have to wait until the end of the presentation. And so if there's anybody who has some, quick processing skills, you're welcome to be the first in line. So I am happy to introduce Daniel Villao, who is the CEO and principal at Intelligent Partnerships. He formerly served as the Deputy Administrator in the Office of Apprenticeship for the U.S. Department of Labor. He is also a published author and considered a national authority on workforce and supply chain inclusion design. With decades of experience in policy development, Daniel has had proven success in innovative supplier access design and training. Daniel successfully led teams that redesigned federal workforce support systems, helping major employers such as Microsoft, Lufthansa, Zurich, and AON adapt new models of workforce development systems that benefit America's workers and employers. He specializes in implementing an innovative and accessible equity policy and workforce design that transforms businesses and adds value to all aspects of organizations. Daniel has dedicated his career to analyzing the ever-changing landscape of the workplace and helping organizations navigate that world of work, creating jobs that make sense in emerging models, and redefining the role of HR into a market capture facilitator. His innovative models are leading compliance transformation in procurement and includes the groundbreaking design of the Intelligent Validation digital platform, for which there is a patent pending. Finally, Daniel is the author of the acclaimed Beyond Green Jobs, which addresses a systems approach to diversity and inclusion in the construction sector in a future world defined by climate change. So thank you for being here, Daniel. The floor is yours.
It's a genuine pleasure, and I apologize that the team sent you the full version of intro there. First of all, I just want to thank Dr. Pauli for his comments, and I'd like to build a little bit on the dialogue that you were sharing right now. I think that language matters, and that gap that the doctor spent a little time trying to navigate, the difference between benefit and mitigation is a long bridge, right? There's a difference between planning structured solutions to offset impacts that we know will be generated versus defining benefits that a particular community will get by moving forward with particular practice or program engagement. And so I think that that's a really important nuance that people just need to understand. And community benefit agreements have been used to offset some environmental mitigations in Oregon and California, in a variety of different environments, but they're typically utilized to present options and opportunities for communities to add new services or new access to new facilities, or things like playgrounds or green spaces, or public housing, et cetera, that are built in to large-scale development of different types as an obligation for a prime contractor to receive all of the permitting access that they seek. And so that's a very important but nuanced conversation that happens in these spaces. As the doctor and your previous questions pointed out, these are very matrixed environments, very complex, that have multiple pieces that are being discussed simultaneously. And so from our experience, and if you don't mind, I'll share my screen. From our experiences, you know, we spend quite a bit of time helping organizations design policy in order to create the greatest value, right? And so, and that can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't necessarily mean reducing environmental impact. It can mean creating local jobs or creating access for diverse contractors, et cetera, which is where we spend quite a bit of our time. And so one of the things that that not only this agency, but any state really has to consider right now is the impacts of federal investments over the next 2 decades. These investments have been designed specifically to enhance job creation, small business access, local value to communities, without taking into consideration those questions that are being raised here around environmental impact and such. And so the dollars that are being proposed or that have already been appropriated and are moving into states for consideration have obligations tied to them that ensure that there's compliance criteria tied to those investment dollars. Now, in some cases, there are environmental impact criteria that are tied to these dollars. My presentation doesn't touch on those, but the regulatory language around the infrastructure bill and the other buckets of investments is pretty extensive. And the EPA, and the Department of Energy has also included significant guidance around their investments, et cetera. So there are some guideposts in place that talk about some of the potential benefits, or in the case as we've been discussing, mitigations to the impacts of these investments. From our perspective, we really try to take a deep dive and ensure that there's stackable value in the procurement that organizations like yours or like the state of Minnesota engage with and engage through to create opportunities for the communities that are being impacted and are represented. I'm happy to give you examples of how these are abused on a regular basis, but I'd like to start with just discussing a couple of examples that have allowed policy design benefits to be utilized in a way that's significantly powerful when these types of investments are moved forward. Again, I would just qualify this as less of an EPA oversight mitigation strategy and more of the benefit that can be tied to the type of investment. Happy to chat a little bit about how things can be mitigated or what the connection points are, and I think you'll see them as I talk a little bit about one of these examples. But really, that dual road of local benefits received through public investment or public-private partnerships versus the cost of that benefit is really what we're discussing, right? Like, at what point does communities say, well, wait a minute, it's really nice that you're going to build a stadium, but we're really concerned about water contamination or, energy outputs, et cetera. So those are the kinds of questions that you're struggling with right now. My expertise doesn't necessarily respond to the environmental impact piece, but it does respond to how these agreements can create opportunities that could be seen as benefits that may hold value to constituents that you involve in the process. So the first example that I would point to is the Climate Pledge Arena, which is a new NHL National Hockey League stadium for the Seattle Kraken. It was a new professional sports venue that was designed specifically for a net zero outcome. It utilized the community workforce agreement, which is an iteration of a community benefit model. And it integrated low and no environmental justice impact designs by working with community, government, and builders to maximize the value while minimizing the footprint. The second example that I utilize is that I'm utilizing is a policy piece that was moved through a Climate 40 initiative. That's a global initiative for some of the largest cities in the world that are moving for climate mitigation and modeling policies to help mitigate and reduce the impacts of things that we're already doing right. And that was a collaboration that really centered around policy goal and engagement strategies, and you know, is creating leading models in community input related to public-private partnerships. So in the CWA, a community workforce agreement, it's important that you understand the difference between a community benefit agreement, a community workforce agreement. You may have heard the terms project labor agreement or project stabilization agreement. These are typically related to labor agreements that are reached as projects move forward. The project owner collectively with organized labor and the contractors create rules for working conditions and accountability regarding local jobs, local hiring, and protocols to resolve any potential labor disputes in the region. And they often, you know, include priority hire. There's value in that for a local jurisdiction and the constituents that live and work there. Obviously, the economic development opportunities, employment opportunities, educational opportunities through registered apprenticeship and similar models, increasing the density of the skilled workforce and participation of small disadvantaged minority businesses that may be impacted by the level of work that's provided. And so, you know, the purchaser, the construction purchaser, labor organizations are typically at the center of these types of models. And then contractors who work on these projects are obviously impacted by the community workforce agreement design structure, and they have to meet all the rules that are put in place. One item of note that I would point to is that the bulk of the federal investments, that 3.5 trillion that you saw in my opening slide, requires if not the use of this type of agreement, at least a structure that emulates the agreement so that all of the same data is, that local hiring is utilized, that local training is created as an opportunity for career access, and that local small disadvantaged businesses are utilized in these processes. So how it worked on the Climate Pledge arena with the National Hockey League, they worked with the city of Seattle and King County municipalities to really design commitments that minimize environmental impacts. They also demonstrated added value through commitment to local jobs and businesses, and they established multiple forums and pathways to capture community and key stakeholder input. And that came in the form of outreach events, program education and access to planning materials, surveys, participating in established meeting spaces. So meeting the community where the community was at was really an important factor in the success of this Climate Pledge arena and their community workforce agreement, because they were able to get in front of organizations that are already affected by policy, public policy in the city of Seattle and the state of Washington in this case. And we're able to hear directly from those organizations and the members of that community. And so as an outcome of that, some of the impact that was felt was you know, a variety of certifications around environmental justice, important items of note, you know, obviously zero carbon certification, LEED certifications that are higher levels renewable energy available off-site and on-site, the mitigation of public transport, and the increase in public transportation utilization and water conservation and capture that was scaled in a way that no other facility in the region was doing. The investments were also significant. Local dollars that went to small minority disadvantaged contractors were in excess of 170 million in earnings for contractors. Workers also benefited over $150 million in wages for local workforce were generated, which obviously benefited the local community in terms of taxable wages. 3 million hours of work were generated through that partnership, including wages for apprentices and new entrants into the industry. So this was a demonstration, in our mind at least, of value being generated through these types of agreements. It allowed consensus building around the rules and priorities. It ensured that the outcomes reflected the values that were agreed to, and it created an opportunity for community and for the agency's team to generate buy-in by creating clear communication strategies. We also have been, as I shared with you, doing work with the Just Transition Workforce through the C40 Climate Initiative. That body of work was really focused on research and facilitation. So we did an extensive body of work in terms of talking to workers, talking to employers, talking to community stakeholders, organizations that represented stakeholders, and the result of that facilitated engagement over a period of, I believe it was 8 to 10 months, really resulted in a council that will be appointed. It has yet to be appointed. They're still working through final decisions at the task force level about how local workers will be able to influence the outcomes of the training to move them from energy extraction work occupations into more environmentally friendly occupations. This was an extensive body of work that required juggling many spinning plates and a lot of different interests, and really listening is the biggest thing and the takeaway. And I think you heard that in Dr. Pauli's statements too, the ability to hear how people are affected, what they believe the impacts are, and either absorbing those beliefs and adapting them to your model, or at least addressing them through your model that you end up adopting, or demonstrating how that concern has been mitigated or eliminated becomes really important. This methodology and facilitation that we created allows workers to raise concerns directly to the task force that is making decisions. It advises workers in advance of issues that they'll be facing or questions that are being raised in terms of the potential direction that this organization is going to take. And it also advises the workforce itself on feedback coming back from the community of stakeholders that have been developed. And so really thoughtful engagement in design has to be the priority. It allows you to generate an access to the overall goal, allows you to facilitate access for stakeholders that desire to engage in the process, creating information portals that allow people to learn about what's happening and how they may be impacted. Also can generate access to two types of stakeholders. One who's concerned about the activity that the agency is taking on and wants to express that concern. And two, empowering people to say, hey, I want to benefit from this, and I think there's value in this, and my voice wants to be lent. to express that appreciation and desire for engagement. And so both sides of the coin, as Dr. Pauli pointed out in his comments, touch together in these spaces, and it creates multiple input opportunities. It can tie environmental justice impact to procurement compliance responsibilities for mutual benefit. And it really focuses on adding value in these spaces. That's it. Let me see if I can stop sharing here. If I can figure that model out. Sorry.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Daniel.
All right. Let me see if I can. Trying to figure out how to stop sharing here. Oh, here it is. Maybe it's because we have too many screens available. All right.
And there's too many platforms to keep track of. Thank you so much for the presentation. We have one question coming in already for you from Linda. Can you give an example of a polluting entity offering a community benefit to offset the impact of their presence?
Sure. As I recall, there's two. One was in Long Beach, California, and I apologize for not remembering the other one, but one of them had to do with a creation of a community development space that included a new school, but the school had high voltage wire lines running directly through play areas as part of its design. And, you would think that it's common knowledge that you shouldn't do that anymore, but in this case, groups were able to raise the concern and were able to actually influence the architectural design to utilize that space for parking areas versus the actual space where young people would spend time and families would be spending extended periods of time on the weekends utilizing sport fields and things of that nature. And so that's one example. The other example, as I recall, in the port of Long Beach, there was some water impacts that were concerned about building a bridge project, a large-scale bridge project there. And so the agency and its partnerships were able to work with community to not only mitigate those, but add additional technology that would ensure that the community overflow systems would alarm and not provide additional contaminants, etc. And I'm happy to dig up some more information as a follow-up to this because I was not ready with those examples directly. Happy to follow up.
Thank you. And I also want to acknowledge there's a couple of comments in here from Nahid. So Nahid, we have captured your comments. Our interpretation is that it's a comment for MPCA to take back, and they will be following up separately. If that's a misinterpretation and you would like Daniel or Dr. Pauli to weigh in, please clarify, but that's our interpretation. So correct us if we're wrong on that. And for everyone else participating, Nahid has left, I believe, a website for the public to submit comments on MnDOT's project, Highway 52, I-94. So thank you, Nahid, for weighing in and providing that resource to the public. Linda follows up to on your comments. Daniel, to be specific, she says, I'm thinking of a refinery or a gas plant that emits pollution.
Yeah, so right now the best example is the one that I shared with you about the C40. That's a collaboration between the city and the county of LA to remove or to move away from oil extraction. There's a lot of oil wells in Los Angeles County that are in very Black and brown communities that need to be capped off and moved away from. The state has placed targets on those dates, but they're also, and our work has centered around the concern that the agencies have about a high value workforce that's very well educated, trained, and very well paid, and the impact to that workforce. And so, so although policy design has included the use to the design of a policy that would eliminate the EJ impact to these communities by terminating the work, period. And then looking at brownfield mitigation to resolve lingering issues. The work that we're focused on is transitioning that workforce. And so I could also ask a few partners about refinery and gas plants specifically. That's helpful. I just don't have that at my fingertips. I hope that kind of answers.
Are there any other, we still have about 10 minutes. If people have questions for either presenter at this point, you are welcome to type that in. We have a question from Maggie. Could you provide some more concrete examples from your experience of what thoughtful engagement looks like? The forums and platforms that seem to truly facilitate that?
Sure. So at Intelligent Partnerships, we focus on stakeholder education. Not only is it important to educate stakeholders on what an organization and agency is planning on doing, but also what they're not doing, I think becomes even more important, right? Their ability to communicate what the policy doesn't mean is just as important as their ability to communicate what it does mean. And so creating educational structures, we like to start at, and this is, I can only speak for our processes at Intelligent Partnerships, we like to start with internal stakeholders, so managers, directors, department heads that are being impacted by policy decisions that are being made. We like to create opportunities for them to engage with those processes so that leaders can hear from division heads, managers, and workforce on what that type of a policy would mean to their existing processes, the layers of complexity that it may or may not add, what changes they would need in their authority in order to be able to move those practices and policies, and any impacts that they feel it would have on their ability to deliver to the public, their responsibility. From there, we move to external stakeholders, right? Because you always forget someone. So, somebody always raises their hand. What about LGBT? What about Black communities? What about Latino communities, et cetera? And so you want to be able to create opportunity engagement around that. One-pagers, desk aids, informational pieces that talk about the policy, the intended timelines, the way that the processes that your organization is moving through in order to ensure that the public is fully engaged. From there, we also structure opportunities for direct engagement, like this webinar, like in-person facilitation, community meetings. As I shared with you with the NHL, what we did was we actually identified community groups, stakeholders that were actively involved with the municipality to ensure that their constituents were all aware and had an opportunity to provide input. And then it's not enough to just hear it and listen to it and capture that data. You have to actually do something with that information, right? So creating matrices about the pros and cons that you're receiving from different pipelines of information, trying to understand whether or not you are either already planning to mitigate or there is no impact for the concern, and create an opportunity for you to be able to say, hey, you don't have to worry about that problem because we're not doing X, Y, or Z. Or to be able to create responses that allow the public and your stakeholders to see that you've actually heard them, and what steps are being taken in order to either eliminate, mitigate, or address concerns that they've raised. Beyond that, remember that there's also an economic interest in all of these discussions, right? So it's not just the environmental impact and the detriment to certain communities that will likely happen in larger scale in communities that are economically disadvantaged. There's also an economic incentive for both public agency to address a particular issue of work that has to be performed or that agency is tasked with performing. And then also the private sector pressure to create economic opportunities and public-private partnerships to develop work that's meaningful, that can create a lot of value in the form of jobs, in the form of tax revenues, in the form of other incentives. And so balancing that equation becomes very difficult, especially if you don't take into account concerns that are being raised. I hope I didn't go too far. And I don't know if Dr. Pauli wanted to add anything.
Sure. I mean, yeah, as far as the thoughtful engagement piece, one thing that I would say is that thoughtful engagement does not necessarily mean successful engagement. When it comes to community engagement, you can be as thoughtful and careful as you like, and things can still go rather wrongly at the end of the day. And I think that's something that just tends to be a little bit messy, inherently, and to some extent, engaging with the community, working with the community means that you've got to embrace that aspect of it. And I would say that, I myself have, I think, developed a pretty open mind to, what constitutes a meaningful meeting. I mean, I do think that you can have a meeting where people get angry and where you don't manage to get through your agenda and where, you veer off in various directions. But I think that actually at the end of the day, that can be really productive and constructive, if only because it gives people an opportunity to air grievances that need to be aired, to get issues out on the table. And of course, you would want there to be follow-up meetings. And one of the things I found, I had to really work hard to convince some of our EPA enforcement folks to participate in a community meeting in Flint with our Water Advisory Council. They were very reluctant to do it. It's not really in their wheelhouse. They finally agreed to do it. There was anger at the meeting. There was contention at the meeting. And unfortunately, I think those guys left the meeting thinking, what a disaster, I'll never do that again. That's not how I left that meeting. I mean, I looked at what happened there and I thought, boy, it was a good thing that we got that stuff into the open. And now hopefully we'll have an opportunity to follow up on it, maybe in a way that's somewhat more constructive. Unfortunately, that didn't really happen in this case, because again, I think on the agency side, there's so much nervousness about this stuff. And again, I think also, maybe just a different philosophy or sensibility that people are bringing to these engagements. And so, I think that, at the very least, I mean, if we can make any generalizations about this, having the community involved from the beginning and planning the engagement can be really useful. So despite all of the contention with our state Department of Environmental Quality around, issues of air pollution in particular in Flint, some of those same activists that have been pushing the state have also collaborated with that same agency in doing some community meetings here that, had an educational component, but that also had a community conversation component. And I think those were pretty successful meetings. So, again, to some extent anyway, it matters, who's involved on the front end.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And there's also, although people, local municipalities and state agencies have a tremendous amount of authority in what they engage with, how they procure, etc. But there are policies and pieces and decisions that they don't have authority over. And I think that oftentimes that gets overlooked as well. There can often be interventions at the federal level, at the state level, from a governor's office or somewhere else, right? That a public agency just doesn't have the ability to maneuver around. And so, and that's where the public pressure that you talked to about can really have an impact. And there's a question, I know there's a few hands raised, but there was a question that was raised in the chat about, how do you get the broadest circle of constituents and community members to participate? I'm a big fan of road shows. I like to make sure that you give an opportunity to all of the impacted regions to have exposure to these kinds of conversations. Oftentimes it becomes a budget issue, right? How much of the budget does a public agency want to expand on capturing this important information versus delivering the product outcome that they've committed to deliver? And so, and there's also a struggle between whether it comes under the public agency's budget or the prime contractor's budget, et cetera, right? So all of these things have to be considered. And so I would just mention those kinds of levers to the participants on this call so that you can think about the most powerful way to engage in these processes.
Thank you, both of you. We have a couple comments or questions over chat. And Hassan, I see you, I see your hand, but because Hassan is with MPCA, I think you'll understand that I'm going to get to our community members first. And if we have time, I'll get to your question, Hassan. So from Cassandra, your comment has a few questions, so I'll just read them all off. And this goes for both presenters. How do you define community when we're looking to have community define what benefit means and what risks are not acceptable in projects? Even if we meet community where they already are, there's still some choice in where we go to meet. So how do we make sure and show that communities are represented well and equitably in these types of processes?
Yeah, so my tendency is to define it in the broadest terms. I don't think you can exclude any voice from these discussions. I think the weight that you give the voice becomes important, because not that one community member is more important than any other community member, but the impact that that they will face, as well as the benefit that they may get, becomes important. I, as a contractor, as a consultant, gain value if they use a community workforce agreement, and I'm given the opportunity, my company's given the opportunity to be a third-party administrator. There's a certain value in that for me. So I'm not just speaking because I happen to believe that this is the only way to get things done. I'm speaking because I've found it to be a successful mechanism, and we think that it can add value, and but we do get a benefit if we get to participate in those environments. So there's kind of a sliding scale, perhaps, of what you have to think about when you're taking into consideration. I'll give you one quick example, and then I'll release the microphone to Dr. Pauli if he has comments. But when you're looking at the contracting community, whether it's the AGC or non-union contractors or union contractors or whoever, their employers, their interest in capturing the work that comes out of these policies. They're going to have a certain viewpoint, and they're going to press to move as aggressively as possible to do it in the way that is minimally disruptive to their normal practices, et cetera. Where you may have a community advocacy group that focuses on low-income, disadvantaged communities, and especially on the environmental impacts that programs like this might have for the community that they represent. Their interest is in ensuring that nothing else gets piled on to the stuff that they're already facing, right? So how does an agency then balance out the needs of those two constituencies? They can't. So they have to make the best decision that they can make based on the amount of input that they get, the balance between, as I said before, mitigation and benefit, and how to move forward in the most positive way possible.
And we have about 3 minutes.
Mhm.
Dr. Pauli, do you have anything to add that would be maybe a minute long?
Okay, yeah, it's a super quick answer to a very complicated question. And I'm going to be accused of circular logic here or something, but you know, I do think that to some extent you've got to let the community define the community. So, you know, what does that look like? It means saying, well, here's who we've engaged, who's missing, right? And we often do hear that kind of talk, like who isn't at the table that needs to be at the table. And you can have people from the local area, you know, pointing you as Daniel was saying to, you know, some other constituency that you've missed, you know, and so, you know, I think that we do have to be really intentional about trying to get a diverse, you know, cross section of any particular community we're working with, because I think there is a strong tendency, because it's easier to some extent to kind of pick our favorites, you know, within a given community, and it tends to be folks that are especially loud or prominent for whatever reason, and you know, you go back to them again and again and again and again. But there's definitely a real danger in that you're missing a lot of other perspectives.
Thank you. Wonderful. I really want to say again, thank you to our speakers. There's one last, I also want to acknowledge one last chat here from Mary. We see your chat. Very great point about geographic boundaries, a project that goes beyond the geographic boundaries of a host community. So noted, MPCA will take note of your comment, and Linda, your comment as well. So thank you to everyone for participating, and I will have Maggie from PCA wrap things up with some final remarks.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Dr. Pauli and Daniel Villao for presenting today and sharing your expertise. We have reached the end of our co-learning webinar series. I just want to give everyone a brief heads up that you probably already got the email, because if you got here, it's because you get our emails. But we are going to have a May session where Hassan will actually walk through not a proposal, but sort of what do we understand that the statute requires us to do, because we are doing this at the direction of the legislature. And we're really using that to set up the summer work sessions. I know everyone's ready to dive in with ideas. We are too, and we're getting ready. And so we will come back with dates and topics for you for summer sessions on these key rule components. It will be conceptual at this stage. It will not be like draft language, because we want to bring you in early. We want to hear people's ideas. We want to bring ideas from these spring webinars to the sessions, other research we've done, other experiences and research you've done. Into this process. So May 28th is the next webinar. That will be all virtual still. Hassan will be the main event. And then we will move into summer sessions, details on place and time and topics to come. Thank you all again. Thank you, DeYoung, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you. Take care.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.